Let's start with the sword, the most iconic weapon in human history. Swords have been used for over 3,000 years, and they come in dozens of varieties. But they all share one thing, a sharp blade designed for cutting or thrusting. The key to a good sword is balance. Too heavy, and you can't swing it quickly. Too light, and it won't deliver enough force. The center of balance is usually a few inches from the hilt, giving you control while maintaining striking power. Different cultures developed different sword styles. European longswords were designed for slashing and thrusting with a straight double-edged blade. They were versatile weapons used by medieval knights in full armor. The blade was typically 30 to 40 inches long, and the sword weighed around 3 pounds. Then there's the rapier, a thinner, lighter sword designed purely for thrusting. Popular in Renaissance Europe, rapiers were dueling weapons. They relied on speed and precision rather than brute force. The long, narrow blade could slip between armor joints or strike vital areas with deadly accuracy. Swords required skill to use effectively. They were expensive to make, so they were often symbols of status. Warriors spent years training to master swordplay. It wasn't just about strength. It was about timing, footwork, and reading your opponent. Now let's talk about the katana, the legendary Japanese sword. This weapon is famous for its curved blade, razor-sharp edge, and the meticulous craftsmanship that goes into making one. Katanas were made using a process called folding. Japanese swordsmiths would heat, hammer, and fold steel over and over, sometimes hundreds of times. This removed impurities and created layers of hard and soft steel. The result? A blade that was incredibly sharp, but also flexible enough not to shatter on impact. The curve of the katana serves a purpose. It's not just aesthetic. The curve allows for more efficient slashing motions. When a samurai draws and cuts in one motion, a technique called Iai Jutsu, the curve helps the blade slice through the target smoothly. Katanas typically weigh around 2.5 pounds and have a blade length of about 24 to 28 inches. They were wielded with 2 hands for maximum control and power. The sharpness of a well-made katana is legendary. Stories tell of blades that could cut through silk scarves dropped onto the edge. But katanas weren't indestructible. The hard steel edge could chip if it struck armor or bone at the wrong angle. That's why samurai trained extensively to strike with precision. Next up, the spear, the most common weapon in human history. Why? Because it's simple, effective, and cheap to make. A long shaft with a pointed tip. That's it. The spear's greatest advantage is reach. You can strike an enemy from 6 to 10 feet away, keeping yourself out of danger. In ancient warfare, armies of spearmen could form tight formations, like the Greek phalanx, where overlapping shields and rows of spear points created an almost impenetrable wall. Spears were also versatile. You could thrust with them, throw them, or use the shaft to block attacks. They didn't require years of training like swords. A farmer could pick up a spear and be effective in battle within weeks. Different cultures used different spear designs. Short stabbing spears like the Roman pilum were designed to pierce shields and armor. Longer pikes, sometimes 15 to 20 feet long, were used to stop cavalry charges. The shaft was usually made of wood, ash, oak, or bamboo, because it needed to be light enough to handle but strong enough not to break. Spears dominated battlefields for thousands of years. Even after swords became popular, spears remained the backbone of most armies. Now let's talk about the bow and arrow, the ultimate range weapon before gunpowder. Bows allowed hunters and warriors to kill from a distance, and a skilled archer could be devastatingly effective. A bow works through stored energy. When you pull back the string, you're bending the limbs of the bow, storing potential energy. Release the string, and that energy transfers to the arrow, launching it at high speed. A powerful longbow could shoot an arrow over 200 yards. There are different types of bows. The English longbow was tall, sometimes 6 feet or more, and required immense strength to draw archers trained from childhood to build the muscle needed to use one effectively. Longbows could penetrate armor at close range, making them feared weapons on medieval battlefields. Then there's the recurve bow, which has limbs that curve away from the archer when unstrung. This design stores more energy in a shorter bow, making it powerful and compact. Recurved bows were used by horseback archers in Central Asia and the Middle East. Arrows themselves are carefully designed. The fletching, those feathers at the back, stabilizes the arrow in flight. The arrowhead determines its purpose. Broadheads for hunting, bodkin points for piercing armor, or blunt tips for practice. Archery required years of practice. Drawing, aiming, and releasing with consistency took skill, but a trained archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, raining death on enemies from a safe distance. Let's talk about the axe. Originally a tool for chopping wood, axes became brutal weapons in the hands of warriors. A battle axe has a heavy head with one or two sharp blades. The weight is concentrated at the top, which means when you swing it, momentum does most of the work. Axes don't require as much skill as swords. You don't need precise technique. You just need to connect with your target, and the sheer force will do devastating damage. Vikings were famous for their axes. The Dane axe was a massive two-handed weapon with a long handle and a broad blade. It could cleave through shields, armor, and limbs with ease. Viking warriors would often carry both an axe and a shield, using the axe's reach and power to their advantage. Smaller, one-handed axes called hatchets or tomahawks were also common. They could be thrown or used in close combat. Native American tribes famously used tomahawks, which were light, fast, and deadly. The downside of axes? They're slow. Once you commit to a swing, you're vulnerable if you miss. And axes are harder to use defensively compared to swords. And finally, let's talk about guns, the weapon that changed warfare forever. At its core, a gun is simple. It's a metal tube with a controlled explosion. At one end, gunpowder ignites inside the chamber, creating expanding gases. Those gases push a projectile, a bullet, down the barrel at high speed. When the bullet exits, it carries enough energy to penetrate targets from a distance. Early guns, like muskets, were slow and inaccurate. They took minutes to reload and could barely hit a target beyond 50 yards. But they had one huge advantage. You didn't need years of training. A soldier could learn to fire a musket in a few hours. As technology improved, guns became faster, more accurate, and more deadly. Rifling, the spiral grooves inside the barrel, made bullets spin, improving accuracy. Cartridges combined the bullet, gunpowder, and primer into one package, speeding up reloads. Today, firearms are everywhere, but the basic principle hasn't changed. Controlled explosion, projectile, distance. Now the crossbow. This weapon revolutionized medieval warfare because it did something bows couldn't. It gave ordinary soldiers the power of a trained archer. A crossbow uses a mechanical trigger to hold the string in place. You load the bolt, a shorter, heavier projectile than an arrow, and when you pull the trigger, the string releases, launching the bolt with massive force. The advantage? You don't need years of training. A peasant could learn to use a crossbow in a few days. And because the string is held mechanically, you can aim carefully without tiring your arms. The power comes from the weapon, not the user's strength. Crossbows were incredibly powerful. Some could punch through armor that deflected arrows, but they had a major drawback: reload time. Drawing the string back required a mechanical crank or lever, which took much longer than knocking an arrow on a bow. A crossbowman might only get off 2 or 3 shots per minute. Still, crossbows were feared. In fact, the Pope tried to ban them in 1139, declaring them too deadly for Christian warfare. The ban didn't stick, of course. Crossbows remained common on European battlefields for centuries.